Okay, so first of all, thank you very much for having me here. And let's say that what I'm going to present is a nice in-between the two presentations that preceded me. Is it working? Yeah. I'm going to focus on a country case. This is a country-focused analysis where I will be discussing illiberal trajectories in elite and mass politics in France today. What I'm going to present is joint work, so it's the result of work package 3 of the AUTHLIB project, done with Jan Rovny, Elena Kossu, and Romain Lachat in Sciences Po. But then you might wonder, why should we care about a French story in Budapest? France has, of course, some specificities, right? Like all countries that pretend to have some specificities. It's one of the founding member states. It's one of the biggest EU member states. But at the same time, France is a very Western European story in a certain way, because it is a country that is characterized, as you will see, by very resilient institutions and a very stable party system compared to other countries, at least in Western Europe. But paradoxically, this institutional stability has fostered, as you will see in a second, growing normative contestation to democracy. The question that we tried to address in this country report is very straightforward. We wanted to understand to what extent and how, in this context characterized by great institutional stability, where you will see liberal forces have not the institutional position to directly erode democracy, is liberal democracy eroding, nevertheless? And how is it contested in elite politics, specifically political parties, and at the mass level among citizens? The analytical focus of our report is twofold. On the one hand, we wanted to look at direct channels through which support for democracy is and can be eroded, and at the same time, indirect channels. When I refer to direct channels, I refer really to the institutional check and balances, the ways in which political parties and citizens conceive basically constraints on executive power, and the role of the judiciary power in the preservation of democracy. When I speak about indirect channels, I will refer mostly to a process that has been ongoing in France, but not only, of normalization of far-right campaigns and claims in public and policy agendas. We believe that this dual approach is suited to offer a combined elite and mass-level perspective. In order to do this, we are political scientists. So we rely on empirical data that are very short in terms of time coverage. For this report, we used survey experts from the Chapel Hill Expert Survey to reconstruct party positions. And then we also used the survey data from the AUTHLIB project to build populism, illiberalism, and authoritarian indices to cover citizens' orientations. And to give some contextual information, we rely mostly on qualitative data. We use VIDEM to contextualize the case of France in the broader longitudinal trend and global context. We also rely on the accounts of the quality press in France. We use Le Monde. And we work with party press releases and websites. I'm happy to answer all your questions on this, should you have any in the Q&A. But before telling you a French story, let me just introduce you the case of France in the European context. This is a graph that comes from the Chapel Hill Expert Surveys showing support for liberal democracies in different European contexts. And as you can see, actually, France, if you have very good eyes, it's actually slightly below the EU average, which means that France is not a country where, you know, like, democracy is contested blatantly, but it's not either a country where there is no democratic contestation. And interestingly enough, France looks very much like Austria, Italy, and Slovenia, that are cases where illiberal actors have been relatively successful over the last decades, and not only. But then let's move to the French part of the story, right? And let's look at, you know, party support for liberal democracy. Here again, I mean, this graph is very simple to visualize. So here you have support for liberal democracy, and here you have party names. Lower support, higher support. Unsurprisingly, the far-right bloc is located here. These are the Front National and Reconquer, another far-right party that emerged during the last presidential elections in France, occupy actually the bloc of the most negative positions when it comes to democracy in France. This is not surprising in the light of what my predecessors have been saying. What is more interesting instead is that what we observe is that left and green parties here on top form actually the strongest pro-democratic bloc in France today. And what is even more interesting is that actually the conservative right that is located here, the Républicain, the Gaullist right in France, is actually moderately below the center, so closer to the far right pole rather than the left, the center left and left wing poles. But then we also wanted to try to understand what are the issues, right, that go with contestation of democracy in France. And for this, what we did, it was to map issue salience, and I can show you the results in the Q&A if you want, but also trying to understand what type of issues priorities align closely with democratic support. We picked some issues that became particularly important in France, in French public debates over the last decade: LGBTQ rights, protectionism, support of Russia after the invasion of Ukraine, and opposition to immigration. And what we saw is that actually the issue priorities of parties align actually pretty well with democratic support. And unsurprisingly again, the far-right pole scores always very low in terms of democratic support, independently on their salience. But then we also try to understand how today the main contender and the main vocal opponent to a liberal democracy in France, the Rassemblement National, shapes norms and policies. As I mentioned, the Rassemblement National today is not in an institutional position to influence directly the policies that are implemented. But at least at the national level. But at the same time, we found traces of both formal and informal channels through which support for democracy is eroded by the actions of the Rassemblement National. When we focus on formal channels, today the Rassemblement National has 123, 126, depending on whether you consider the beginning or the actual date of the term, of 577 MPs in the French parliament. But actually, the influence that it had on policies, such as the recently voted migration policy reform in 2024, has much to do with the weakening of the Gaullist right, the conservative right, and the presidential majority, Macron's majority. So rather than acting directly in influencing policy because of the numbers of the party in parliament, the party has been important for the presidential majority to maintain actually a majority. The story is a bit different at the local level, where the Rassemblement National is governing some cities in France, not the biggest ones, but still, I mean, strong cities. And at the level of municipalities, what we observed and what other researchers before us observed is that there are specific budget allocation policies that are done and implemented in order, for example, to diminish fundings for civil society, or also activities that are not considered in line with the priorities of the parties. I'm thinking about, you know, like gender education programs, but also like different type of activities like theater and so forth. But where the influence of the Front National has been really, really visible in eroding support for democracy is in the unfolding of public debates in France. With Elena Kossu, we wrote a paper in the framework of the AUTHLIB project where we demonstrated how this happened in the aftermath of the terror attack, the 2015 terror attacks in France. But this is something that is not only limited to the issue of migration and, in the case of France, internal minorities, Muslim minorities, but it's also very recently expanded to the judicial power and to courts. Marine Le Pen has been under trial and condemned for embezzlement of EU funds, and this gave her the chance to publicly contest the authority of the judges in public debates. She actually adopted a very sort of Berlusconian anti-judges rhetoric, where basically she claimed that the judges are upholding from French people the political right to choose their representative. This doesn't have, of course, immediate policy consequences, but is contributing to normalize the legitimation into the judicial power in French public debates. And then through the report, we also identified informal areas of influence of the Rassemblement National in the ownership of media channels, but also reactionary social movement and online influencers. Let me go very quickly through the mass politics side, where we study basically mass attitudes towards democracy using AUTHLIB data. So this is populist, illiberal, and authoritarian orientations in the AUTHLIB countries. This gives us the possibility to locate France in the broader picture. France is near the EU average, both on populism and illiberalism. But authoritarian values are comparatively high compared to other European countries. And this is perhaps something interesting with respect to what you were saying, to what extent, I mean, contemporary forms of illiberalism, at least at the mass level, have something to do with authoritarian or neo-authoritarian forms of nostalgia or beliefs. And unsurprisingly, what we also found is that far-right voters are actually those who score highest on all these dimensions. In terms of the socio-demographic divides that matter in predicting support for democracy, we found basically three main results. Lower educated people are actually those who also score higher on PIA values. Working class groups, especially people working in the service sectors as well. But interestingly enough, and this I think is really like the most interesting finding that we have, is age effects. Age effects varies by dimension in France. You have younger cohorts that are definitely less populist than older groups, but they are also those who have highest scores in terms of endorsement of authoritarian values. So this is definitely something we need to find out. And this is a graph that shows you basically the citizen value orientation by vote choice. And here again, what you can see, to go very quickly, is that parties that are illiberal, they are able today to mobilize constituencies that are receptive of their illiberal message. This is based on votes in the last European parliamentary election in 2024. Let me conclude very quickly because my time is almost over. So basically what we have been finding in this report is that France is a specific case, but not as specific as one could think, in the sense that it is a context characterized by strong institutional stability, where the Rassemblement National that embodies today the main challenger to liberal democracy is not yet in the institutional position to directly influence policies. At the same time, we found different indirect channels through which the normalization of some of the anti-democratic discourses of the Front National, Rassemblement National, is part of public and policy debates in France. The critical junctures ahead for French democracy in the next years will be mostly two. We will have in 2026 municipal elections, and in 2027 presidential elections. And this will be probably decisive to understand the sort of French democracy. We think that beyond the specific case of France, what we can learn out of, in policy terms, out of this report is that actually the gap that exists between formal constitutional protections and informal norm erosions of democracy can actually allow gradual democratic degradation without triggering formal institutional resistance. And this, I think, that is a scenario that we are witnessing, at least in some Western European countries as well, where you don't have major institutional changes that are implemented, such as in the case of some Eastern European countries, but still the process of erosion of democratic support is taking different forms, attacking pluralism in its different facets, not only in cultural terms, but also in terms of media expression and the legitimation of the judicial authority. I stop here. I thank you very much for your attention, and I look forward to hearing your comments and questions.